During the 100 Years' War, France faced a formidable opponent, the invading armies of England. The English relied on a distinctive tactical system that combined the devastating firepower of their longbowmen with the steadfastness of heavily armed men-at-arms. Time and again, even numerically superior French armies struggled against this deadly combination. French commanders desperately tried to search for a way to counter the English tactics, and paid dearly for every attempt. In this video, we'll explore 8 of the most significant battles from the early stages of the 100 Years' War. We'll see how exactly the English system worked in practice, how the French tried to counter it, and how they eventually discovered a way to hold their own against the invaders from across the Channel. The 100 Years' War began in 1337. Not long after, Edward III of England pressed his claim to the French throne and crossed the Channel to assert his rights. Fully aware that France, the economic and military superpower of its time, could field larger armies, and that he would be at a disadvantage in a drawn-out war of attrition, Edward sought to force the French into a decisive battle right from the beginning. He was confident that his troops could prevail against the armies of heavily armed French knights in open field, because England had developed a very effective tactical system in its wars against the Scots. After a spectacularly failed cavalry charge against the Scottish infantry at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the English adapted their tactics. Instead of knights on horseback, they now relied on a combination of dismounted men-at-arms and longbowmen, a combination that proved its effectiveness at the battles of Duplain Moor in 1332 and Halidon Hill in 1333. At Halidon Hill, the English took up a strong position atop a hill, forcing the Scots to attack across marshy ground, up the slope and through a storm of longbowmen's arrows. When the exhausted and battered attackers reached the English line, the dismounted men-at-arms blocked their advance, while the archers caught them in a deadly crossfire. The battle was brief, but brutal. When the Scots broke and fled, the men-at-arms remounted and chased them off the field, crushing the last remnants of resistance. By the time the English arrived in France, news of the Scots' defeats had reached the French king, Philip VI. He knew just how effective English tactics could be, and despite Edward's efforts, he avoided open battle, even when the two kings met in the field in 1339. Edward took up a strong defensive position on a hill between the villages of La Capelle and La Flamengerie, securing the front of his army with a ditch and field fortifications. Behind these defenses, the dismounted men-at-arms formed 3 solid blocks, each flanked by archers. This shows how crucial the careful selection of a strong defensive position was to the success of the English tactics. At La Flamengerie, however, it became clear that a position could be so strong that it became a deterrent. When Philip's scouts reported the English deployment, he abandoned the attack and instead dug in behind a line of abatis, field fortifications made of sharpened tree trunks and branches. His men saw this as cowardly, but though Philip's caution clashed with the French knights' ideas of honor, it spared France a potentially disastrous defeat at the very start of the war. Philip maintained this cautious approach, which meant that the first major field battle of the conflict would not be between the kings themselves, but between their deputies in the War of the Breton Succession. Between 1341 and 1345, several truces interrupted the war between England and France. During this period, the focus shifted to the War of the Breton Succession, which became a kind of proxy conflict. 2 men were contenders to succeed John III, the recently deceased Duke of Brittany, John of Montfort, John III's half-brother, and Charles of Blois, the husband of John's niece and Philip VI's nephew. Naturally, Philip VI supported Charles of Blois, while Edward III back John of Montfort. To support his candidate, Edward sent William de Bohun, the first Earl of Northampton, to Brittany. He landed at Brest in the summer of 1342, liberated the besieged city, and set out to capture the fortress of Morlaix. Charles of Blois, who had initially retreated, soon realized he had more than twice the strength of his opponent and gave chase. When the Earl of Northampton learned that the Franco-Breton army was approaching, he lifted the siege and took up a position on the edge of a grove. His force of nearly 5,000 men fortified the area with traps, cleverly camouflaged with hay and undergrowth. The exact formations and course of the battle are unclear, but chroniclers report that the English men-at-arms fought dismounted. First, they were attacked by Blois's knights on horseback, likely on the flanks, where the archers inflicted heavy losses. The French then pressed on against the center, where the traps took their toll. Despite these obstacles, the French continued their advance and clashed with the English line in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. After several hours of fierce combat, the English emerged victorious. The Battle of Morlaix not only confirmed the importance of carefully selecting and preparing a strong defensive position, but also demonstrated that the men-at-arms were the backbone of the English formations. No matter how relentless the hail of arrows from the archers, the enemy almost always reached the English front line. It was the steadfast men-at-arms who decided the battle's outcome. Without this human wall, the lightly armored archers would have little chance against a direct assault. So the English tactics relied on a kind of symbiosis. The archers weakened the enemy before they reached the men-at-arms, and the men-at-arms stopped the attackers, shielded the archers, and ultimately finished the enemy off. At Morlaix, English tactics proved their worth on French soil for the first time. Charles of Blois, one of France's most capable commanders, took the lesson to heart and immediately began searching for a way to counter the English system. The results of his efforts became clear 4 years later, the Battle of Saint-Pol-de-Léon. In 1345, Edward III broke the truce with France, which was supposed to last until the summer of 1346. He sent troops to Brittany to repel Charles of Blois and secure a potential bridgehead to land his next invasion army. After initial successes, the campaign stalled, as the English failed to capture a port in northern Brittany. By 1346, Edward had decided to land in Normandy with his main army. Still, Sir Thomas Dagworth advanced west, likely on a reconnaissance mission, and was confronted by Charles of Blois at the small town of Saint-Pol-de-Léon. Dagworth, commanding just 80 men-at-arms and 120 mounted archers, was heavily outnumbered by Blois's 1,000 men. With no chance to retreat, he had his troops dismount and take up a strong position on a hill, securing the front with a ditch and the rear with an improvised barrier of wagons and horses. Having learned from Morlaix that cavalry was highly vulnerable in a frontal assault on an English formation, Charles of Blois dismounted the majority of his men-at-arms. This made the Battle of Saint-Pol-de-Léon one of the first battles in which French men-at-arms fought on foot. Aside from reduced mobility, there were few drawbacks. The men were just as well trained for fighting on foot as on horseback, and their close combat skills had been honed in many small sieges of the early 100 Years' War. To offset the loss of mobility, Charles kept about 40 heavily armored horsemen and a division of crossbowmen in reserve at the rear. The Franco-Breton army attacked from two sides simultaneously. Charles sent his mobile striking force around Dagworth's flank to strike from the rear, while the dismounted men-at-arms assaulted the English front in waves. The flanking maneuver stalled at the English wagon line, and the archers unleashed a devastating hail of arrows on the attackers approaching the front. Despite these setbacks, the Franco-Breton forces pressed forward, and a fierce, day-long battle ensued. In the late afternoon, after his men were beaten back multiple times, Charles personally led a final assault. Against the backdrop of the setting sun, he he attacked the English from all sides with 3 divisions, but was repelled once more. The Battle of Saint-Pol-de-Léon highlighted the deadly effectiveness of the English combination of dismounted men-at-arms, field fortifications and longbowmen. Though outnumbered roughly 5-1, not a single English man-at-arms fell, while Charles of Blois lost a large proportion of his army. Even though Charles had lost at the Battle of Saint-Pol-de-Léon, French commanders recognized that dismounted men-at-arms combined with a mobile striking force offered the most promising counter to English tactics so far. Nevertheless, this approach would be put to the test when the first major field battle of the 100 Years' War took place just a few weeks later. A quick book recommendation before we go on. Bernard Cornwell's Grail Quest is a fantastic, well-researched historical fiction series that brings the battles of the early 100 Years' War to life. If you want to check it out, there's a link down below. Buying through that link gives us a small commission at no extra cost to you and really helps the channel. Prefer audiobooks? You can also grab it on Audible through our link and get a free audiobook. All links are in the description and pinned comment. Thanks for considering it, and now back to the video. When Edward III landed in Normandy with his invading army in July of 1346, he began marching through France, plundering as he went. Philip VI had little choice but to confront him. He pursued the English north from Poitiers, near Paris, tried to block them at the Somme, and ultimately, near the small town of Crécy, quote, fell directly into the King of England's trap, as historian Matthew Strickland puts it. The exact deployment of the English and many other details of the Battle of Crécy remain hotly debated. This is not the place to go into those debates, especially since the battle represents a special case in terms of the French approach, as we will see. What is certain is that the English took up a strong defensive position on a hill between the villages of Crécy and Vadicourt. As had become standard practice, they secured the rear with wagons and prepared traps and field fortifications in front of the line. The dismounted men-at-arms formed 3 divisions, each flanked by archers. The head of the French column reached the battlefield shortly before midday. Despite the strong English position, Philip VI attacked before his troops were fully assembled. The reason is unclear. Some suggest political pressure compelled him to act hastily, while others say his knights urged immediate action. Whatever the reason, Philip sent his Genoese crossbowmen forward first, and instantly made a critical mistake. His mercenaries' equipment had been left at the rear of the French column, forcing them to attack with reduced armor and ammunition, and, most importantly, without the protective pavises central to their tactics. Vulnerable and exposed, they were quickly forced to fall back. The second wave, composed of mounted men-at-arms, pressed forward ruthlessly, riding over the retreating crossbowmen. This took away much of their momentum, and they lost cohesion just as they entered the range of the longbowmen. Still, the French men-at-arms reached the English right wing, commanded by Edward of Woodstock, the Black Prince. Just as Edward III had intended, the terrain and English formation funneled the French into a death zone in front of the Black Prince's division. His men stood their ground, wearing down wave after wave of French attackers. The assault only ended around midnight, and the next morning the English men-at-arms mounted their horses and swept the remainder of Philip's army from the battlefield, completing one of the most one-sided victories of the 100 Years' War. Despite his caution, in the end, Philip VI did engage in battle, and paid a heavy price. The Battle of Crécy is often seen as a triumph of the longbowmen over French men-at-arms, highlighting flaws in French tactics and organization. In fact, it was not. The defeat had more to do with Philip's hasty approach. His attack was poorly coordinated, and he ignored the lessons Charles of Blois had learned during the War of the Breton Succession. The Battle of Crécy was, in the words of Matthew Strickland, quote, a disastrous shambles, unrepresentative of the real capabilities of French arms and tactical thinking, end quote. In several smaller battles over the following years, The French proved they were capable of far more than they had shown at Crécy. In 1349, Thomas Coke, the English seneschal of Gascony, was ambushed near the village of Lunalonge. He immediately ordered his men-at-arms and archers to dismount and take up a strong position on a hill. The French, led by Jean de Lille, and outnumbering them roughly 3-1, attacked confidently. One division rode around the Anglo-Gascon troops to strike at their rear, while 2 others assaulted from the front. The troops that bypassed the English managed to seize some horses and baggage, but the frontal attackers met fierce resistance. The horses, making it through the hail of arrows, were mercilessly impaled on the spears of the dismounted men-at-arms. By evening, when Jean de Lille called off the attack, 300 of his men had fallen. The battle confirmed once and for all that frontal cavalry charges against well-deployed English troops were virtually suicidal. The combination of dismounted men-at-arms and mounted shock troops now quickly spread from Brittany into the rest of France. In 1351, when Marshal Guy II de Nesle besieged the fortress of Saint-Jean-d'Angély, he intercepted a convoy of reinforcements at the bridge over the Charente River near Taillebourg. Following Charles of Blois' example, the Marshal dismounted the bulk of his men-at-arms, only keeping 2 cavalry reserves on the wings. He then prepared to attack both frontally and from the flanks. However, the plan never came to fruition. Reinforcements from Taillebourg and Tonnay-Charente arrived near the rear, surprising Guy de Nesle before he could advance. 2 weeks later, on the 6th of June 1351, Edward I de Beaujeu attacked an English raiding party led by John de Beauchamp, the captain of Calais, near Ardres, about 600 kilometers north of Taillebourg. The retreating English took up a defensive position in a bend of the river and secured it with a ditch. Once again, the French attacked using a combination of dismounted men-at-arms and mounted shock troops. Although Edward de Beaujeu was killed at the very start of the battle, his men kept up the pressure until the English archers ran out of arrows. This allowed the French cavalry to bypass the defenders and strike from the rear. While Ardres cannot be considered a decisive success for the French method, since it was likely the lack of arrow reserves that decided the outcome, combined with Taillebourg, it does demonstrate that the tactic of dismounted men-at-arms had now spread throughout France. How promising the French approach was became clear at the Battle of Mauron in 1352. This time, Guy de Nesle faced an Anglo-Breton force under Sir Walter Bentley. Bentley had positioned his men on a slight rise between a hedge and some bushes. As was now standard, about 1,500 men-at-arms formed the center, while roughly 800 archers held the wings. Again, the French attacked both frontally and on the flanks. This time, the assault force broke through at the first attempt, with devastating results. When the armored horsemen smashed into the unprotected side of the English right wing, it collapsed almost immediately, exposing the center. Meanwhile, the French men-at-arms fought their way through the bushes in front of the English position, attacking head-on and pressing the enemy against the hedge. Victory seemed within reach, until the French center suddenly faltered. On the right, part of the formation inexplicably fell back, giving the English archers an opportunity to advance and strike into the exposed flank of the French. At the Battle of Mauron, the French came closer to defeating an English formation than at any point since the start of the war. Their plan had worked flawlessly until the inexplicable retreat of part of their men-at-arms disrupted the attack. This near success, however, helped shape French tactics for the next major engagement. At the Battle of Poitiers, the combination of dismounted men-at-arms and fast-moving shock troops would be deployed in a large-scale battle for the first time in the war. In In 1356, the Black Prince led a chevauchée from Gascony north into Poitou. King John II pursued him and confronted the English south of Poitiers. Prince Edward, seizing a convenient opportunity for battle, chose a position perfectly suited to English tactics. A gentle slope with a few hedgerows lay in front of his troops, the forest of Noailles behind them, and the Mionçon River to their left. On the right, the English built a barricade of wagons and brushwood. Edward deployed his troops in 3 divisions, with longbowmen forming the wings and securing the front. They dug trenches between the hedgerows and constructed field fortifications to strengthen their position. Behind the army, a mounted reserve stood ready to exploit any breakthrough or launch a counterattack. On the 18th of September, as the 2 armies faced each other, King John II drew up his plan of attack. He was determined to avoid repeating the disaster of the Battle of Crécy. His troops had thoroughly reconnoitred the English position, were well rested, and the king had carefully considered how he wanted to proceed. He divided his forces, approximately 10,000 men-at-arms, 2,000 infantry, and 2,000 crossbowmen, into 3 divisions. Each division consisted of a central body of foot soldiers, flanked by crossbowmen. Aside from 2 smaller shock troops totaling 300 to 500 armored horsemen, all the men-at-arms fought on foot. On the morning of the 19th of September, Edward prepared for battle, but then, unexpectedly, ordered his left wing to retreat across the Mionçon. The French feared this might be a feint, designed to lure them into attacking an almost impregnable position, but they decided to take the chance and press the assault. One group of mounted men skirted the hedge on the right, aiming to strike the side of the exposed English centre, while another tried to force a gap through the bushes to attack the English right wing. When the first group reached the hedge, English archers caught them in a deadly crossfire. Arrows fell like rain, bringing down horses and routing their riders. Meanwhile, the second assault force had nearly reached the left flank of the English centre. Just as the riders accelerated to charge, the English left wing appeared behind them, having returned from the ford and launching a counterattack. Caught between 2 fronts and under heavy fire, the French men-at-arms could not hold their ground for long. With the rapid mounted assault having failed, the 1st French division on foot advanced. As they pushed through the hedgerows, they suffered heavy losses at the hands of the English archers. Nevertheless, the French reached the English front, and a bloody hand-to-hand battle ensued. Despite fierce fighting, the English line held firm, and after 2 hours, the French were forced to retreat. So far, all of King John's attacks had failed. However, 2/3 of his army was still fresh, while the English were exhausted. Many were wounded, and their archers were running low on arrows. Yet the French, once again, made a critical mistake. The 2nd Division interpreted the retreat of the first wave as a signal to pull back, abandoning the advance instead of maintaining pressure. This pause gave Edward time to regroup his troops before King John's 3rd Division could engage. France had squandered another opportunity. When King John attacked with the 3rd Division, he sent his crossbowmen ahead. Unlike the mercenaries at the Battle of Crécy, these troops were fully equipped. Step by step, they advanced up the slope with their pavises, securing the ground to the English front. Slowly but surely, Edward's situation became precarious. Many of his archers had already set aside their bows, useless without arrows, and drawn their swords to engage in close combat. Yet the Black Prince still had one ace up his sleeve. Around 60 men-at-arms, accompanied by a few dozen mounted archers, had ridden in a wide arc around the hill to the right of the battlefield. Now they charged into the rear of King John's forces. This surprise attack proved a turning point. As the French scrambled to deal with the threat from behind them, the Black Prince ordered some of his men-at-arms to remount and strike the shattered formation from the front and flank. The English horsemen thundered down the hill, crashing into the French lines. John's division disintegrated under the force of the impact, and soon collapsed completely, sealing the outcome of the battle. The French had suffered another crushing defeat. Around 2,500 of their men-at-arms were killed. Around 3,000 men, including King John himself, were taken prisoner. The English, by contrast, lost just 40 men-at-arms. Yet Poitiers also showed the English method was no longer infallible. A full third of the French army had never struck a blow, and still the victory was far harder won than most English triumphs of the previous 20 years. In earlier battles, the first volleys of arrows often decided the outcome, but at Poitiers, the result remained uncertain even after 100 volleys. When the first phase of the 100 Years' War ended with the Peace of Bretigny in 1360, the French had still not found a reliable way to counter the English tactical system. However, their adaptations, both tactical and technical, had made them far better able to withstand the firepower of the English longbowmen. Dismounted men-at-arms were less vulnerable to arrows than mounted ones, and heavier armor and the increasing use of pavises gave them even more protection. At the same time, mounted shock troops provided a mobile element for flanking attacks. But although these changes reduced the effectiveness of the English longbowmen against French men-at-arms, they were still not enough to overcome the full strength of English tactics. It was only when the war resumed in 1369 that the French finally found a way to counter the English system. After the Battle of Poitiers, Charles V assumed control of the government while his father remained a prisoner of the English. He realized the futility of continuing to counter the English tactics with direct confrontation, as it was not the most effective way to defeat them. The real underlying problem was that the English could plunder, raid, and besiege French territory unhindered, if they were not stopped. While battles were the usual means to prevent this, they were not the only option. Instead, Charles V adopted a Fabian strategy, meaning he avoided major engagements, instead relying on attrition and indirect attacks. In sieges and small-scale skirmishes, the French were easily able to keep pace with the English, and by 1374 they had recaptured nearly everything they had been forced to cede under the Peace of Bretigny. Yet Charles and his father recognized that lasting victory would require additional measures. In 1363 they began reforming the French armies, creating a modern war machine of their own. How these new powerful armies dealt with the English, however, is a topic for another video. To conclude, let me thank you for watching the video. I hope it's clear that this video took a lot of time and effort. We love to do this, but it's not easy and it takes a lot of resources. If you think these kinds of videos are worth your money, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It's a good way to support any creator. And for us, it means that we remain independent and can produce videos on topics that we like and that we think are important. So we don't have to cater to hype and trends, which in our opinion doesn't work well for a channel about history. Thank you.